Philip Larkin is possibly one of the most remarkable poets of the 20th century, and certainly as far as the Leaving Cert curriculum is concerned, he's one of the most difficult poets on the course. All of the action really happens in between the lines with Larkin. We usually don't recommend to Leaving Cert students that they focus too much on a poet's biography because ultimately the marks are going for your examination of the poem, the themes and the poetic techniques. However, in this case, it's really quite difficult to understand what the message of the poems really is if you don't know a little bit about the poet. So we're going to take a slight detour and talk about Larkin himself. He was born in 1922 in England. He spent most of his life working as a librarian, and he was also quite a famous jazz critic. He never married, even though he was in a number of long-term relationships. He was born right after the end of the First World War. He lived through the Second World War and the austerity that followed, and then on to the liberation of the 1960s with the hippie movement, the sexual liberation, and the youth culture as we know it today. Larkin has been accused of being melancholic, meaning overly negative, overly sad, and his tone and mood can be quite difficult to understand, so we will dwell on it a little longer. A lot of what he describes is bleak and post-industrial, and we can understand that because of the difficult times that he lived through. An example of his negativity would be his description in At Grass of squadrons of empty cars and heat and littered grass. He paints quite a number of dystopian images in his poems. This is just one example. He's also been described as being somewhat misanthropic, kind of antisocial and hateful to people around him in his poems. So for example, in The Wits and Weddings, he says, "Mothers loud and fat, and uncle shouting smut, and the perms, the nylon gloves, and jewellery substitutes." This description is really somewhere between complete misanthropy and stand-up comedy. At the same time, it's quite relatable, so we'll examine that in more detail. And finally, is he a little bit iconoclastic? Talking about a church in the terms of some brass and stuff up at the holy end, that's quite derogatory really when you think about it for the 1950s when that poem was written. Larkin has been described by other poets as being very English. His publisher described him as being a mixture of lyricism and discontent, meaning that he's quite emotional and unhappy in his poems. So his rather intellectual approach actually manages to stimulate a lot of emotion in the reader, so that's quite important. Larkin himself said that he wants to be regarded as a chap chatting to chaps, and he wished that people would talk about his poems in the pub. His attitude came to be regarded as being quintessentially English, meaning that his distant cynicism hides a warmth and an admiration for the subjects of his description. Possibly the best example of this is The Wits and Weddings, and it's important for us to remember that Larkin isn't just an English-speaking poet, he's very much an English poet. So sometimes the context of what he's saying is a little bit lost on us. So to list off some of the key themes that Larkin raises in his poetry, death and transience feature in at least half of the poems on the course. Marriage is another theme that's mentioned quite a lot. It's interesting that Larkin never married himself, yet he mentions weddings and mentions marriage quite a lot in his poetry. Larkin also gets quite philosophical in his reflection on values. So for example, in his reflection in An Arundel Tomb, he talks about everlasting love and whether it's really a real thing or it's a romanticized notion that really doesn't exist. In the poem At Grass, Larkin describes two horses who are retired from their glory days of being winning racing horses. Now the horses have been left alone, they're no longer famous, they're no longer admired, and yet they seem happier and at peace. So it's important to remember that the horses here symbolize something. It's not a poem about animal rights. It's a poem about whether recognition and awards are important, or whether being allowed to do things on your own terms and having freedom is more important. Larkin talks about war in his poem 1914. And finally, religion comes up quite a lot in his poems, not just directly through the mention of churches and cathedrals, but there are a number of religious allusions hidden in his poems. So now that we've spoken about the themes, we'll talk about the techniques. Enjambment is one of the key techniques associated with Larkin. Virtually all his poems include at least some enjambment, and that is the use of run-on lines. It's the continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line. So no punctuation at the end of a line, put very simply, is what we would call enjambment, and you will see an example on the next slide. Why would a poet use enjambment? It is to emphasize the fact that the meaning of a sentence keeps changing with every following on line. And that is a method to emphasize transience. So you thought you knew what you were reading, and yet you read another line and you realize that the meaning is completely changed. We talked about how death and transience are important concepts in Larkin's poetry, and this is just another way to emphasize that this too shall pass. In the poem 1914, if you look at it carefully, you will see that it is basically one long sentence of 150 words. So Larkin really was quite different in how he used his punctuation. Larkin used precise rather than elaborate imagery. So in an Arundel tomb, stationary voyage is a very interesting term. It basically emphasizes that while the monument is still, so it's stationary, it will never move, the couple are making a journey through time. Of course, after the poem was written, Larkin found out subsequently that the tombs actually started off separate, that it was during a restoration of the monument, some creatively inclined sculptor decided that it's better to join the two tombs and put their hands together. So really the poem is quite historically inaccurate, but the purpose of this precise image is to emphasize the effect of time, that time takes us on a journey whether we want it or not. In his poem 1914, there is another kind of a stilling image, restless silence. And so the reader, with the First World War on their mind, when they hear the mention of fields of wheat, they imagine those fields being used for war. And now that they're silent, they must be covered in what remained after a battle. And that's a very emotional image when you think about the blood that was spilt in those battles. This is an example of how, by saying just two words, Larkin manages to twist our minds into thinking about something very emotional. His image is very precise, but it's not very elaborate. And in Church Going, Larkin mentions his awkward reverence. So, although he was describing the church in a very bored tone, he then felt the need to take off his bicycle clips because he couldn't take off his hat. So the very nature of the building that he was in made him experience this religious, this spiritual sentiment, even though he's not a religious person. And it's just a very precise and relatable way to describe it, an awkward reverence. Perhaps the reader experienced this when going into a temple of a religion that they don't belong to. There's something awkward about it, and yet you still get that reverence when you look upon it, even as a tourist. Having said that Larkin is quite dry and precise, some of his poems culminate in these transcendent metaphors, and Explosions is possibly the best example of it. He imagines the widows seeing their husbands walking towards them with the light shining behind them in a kind of a golden halo. So there are a number of examples like this. The Whitsun weddings and Wedding Wind have this build-up and culmination kind of dynamic in them. We already mentioned that Larkin has a detached tone. So in Explosions, the opening line is deliberately informative, as if it's from a newspaper on the day of the explosion. And of course, this only highlights the tragedy that we're about to see. In Churchgoing, he couldn't sound more bored. Another church. He's quite derogatory at the start, but he gets quite philosophical towards the end of the poem. And sometimes Larkin really took his boredom to the limits. In An Arundel Tomb, he says that there are little dogs under the feet of the Earl and the Countess. And in this picture here, you can see quite clearly that this is not a dog. Another interesting thing to note about Larkin's poetry is that while he's agnostic, religion keeps coming up in his poetry. So, for example, in Explosions, he mentions the sun being hidden by the cloud of dust that was raised by the explosion. This is an allusion to the crucifixion darkness. So, when Christ was nailed on the cross, the sun went down during the day, according to the Bible. And this is a technique that Larkin uses to emphasize the innocence of these men and the tragedy that befell them. It's a little bit similar to what he does in his poem 1914, actually. So you can feel this subtle empathy. He might seem quite misanthropic and hateful in his poems, but really there's a lot of tenderness that's really hidden behind layers and layers of his poetry. And another interesting thing to say about these lines here, the sun was scarfed. So we're kind of thinking about the men who perhaps weren't in the epicenter of the explosion, but were in the collapsed mine and were suffocating without air. So Larkin has a way to drag us into this detached poem and cause a lot of emotions, despite the fact that initially he seems so cold and so distant. This really is a bit of a highlight reel, and if you want more in-depth analysis of Larkin's poetry, you should head over to our website, and it's really a treasure trove of sample essays and notes on each poet. Lots of it is in open access. There is a full guide for the English course for this year, and you will find exquisite notes on other subjects for the Leaving Cert as well. Best of luck, guys, in your studies.